Thank you, Anthony, for your very generous introduction. And I'd like to thank Sarah and all other members here, my friends and colleagues in the Center for South Asia, and other faculty members, research scholars who have gathered here today to listen to this talk. In fact, I feel privileged to be here to share some of the contents of my lecture and my research, particularly which I have been doing since 2008-9 as part of our university research program as well, that was conducted under the Special Assistance Program of the University Grants Commission. So we have been engaged in the documentation, translation, and analysis of Dalit and tribal literature of the Eastern India. And in course of our research, we have also expanded the horizon of our research, and we have included the kind of writings we found in Bangladesh and in some of the neighboring northeastern states as well. So we have been looking at both language and literature of the Dalit communities. Along with that, we have also included the language and literature of the Adivasi communities, who have also been symbolically grouped under Dalits. Today's title of my presentation, Representation of Humiliation in Dalit Literature, will have actually two sections. In the first section, I would like to talk about the general representation of humiliation in Indian Dalit literature, especially in Dalit autobiographies and also other genres of Dalit writings. And in the second part of my talk, I would be specifically looking at the Bengali Dalit literature. And my main contention is that compared to the representation of humiliation in other states of India, in Bengal, there had been a relatively low decibel representation of humiliation or experience of humiliation due to various factors. So I will be looking into those factors which actually created an environment where Bengali Dalit experience of humiliation was in a less visible, less politicized, or in a way, an empiric kind of representation of this experience. So let me move on to my next slide. This is a question which is actually the question of my presentation today. Is there a lesser degree of humiliation in Bengal? And this question is triggered by an interview which was given by the most representative Bengali Dalit writer of the present time, Monoranjan Bapari, in an interview with Shipra Mukherjee, who is a professor of English and who translated the autobiography of Monoranjan Bapari, Itibritte Chandal Jivan. So in an interview, Monoranjan Bapari admits that the severity of caste oppression is absent in Bengal. It's on record, it's published in an anthology. In fact, many factors are responsible for this not so loud presence of caste conflict in the public sphere. On a closer scrutiny, it may also appear that the non-recognition is also a marker of a lesser degree of intensity. Had it been a mass genocide of Dalits by the upper caste goons, much in vogue in the northern heartland, it would have been impossible to gloss over such incidents as sporadic. So somewhere, we find in the long interview of Monoranjan Bapari, there is a constant comparison with the kind of atrocities perpetrated upon the Dalit population in other states of India, particularly in the northern heartland of India, with that of Bengal. In fact, I would like to refer to this text, Dalit text, Aesthetics and Politics Reimagined, because this book, edited by Judith Mishrai Barak, K. Satyanarayana, and Nicole Thiara actually includes the long interview of Manoranjan Bapari. In fact, if we look at the discourse of humiliation and the social paradox, we find that the social hypocrisy in the Indian public sphere is the fulcrum of a regulated practice of untouchability. The poor Dalit woman, despised as untouchable in the public sphere, is physically abused and raped in the private space without any qualms of untouchability-based moral discourse. If you go through the autobiographies of many Dalit writers, Sharan Kumar Limbale, Akkar Mashi, or Sevraj Singh Bechan, Mere Bachpan Mere Kandho Par, you will find how these poor Dalit, quote unquote, untouchable women become eminently touchable in terms of the discourse of desire by the upper caste, men. So it is recorded in almost all the autobiographies which we can come across. The discourse of humiliation rests on this social paradox sustained by the dominant social elites. And there are contradictory responses to the gender vulnerabilities, and this problematizes this practice of humiliation even more. In fact, I would now like to refer to the humiliation of the denotified and nomadic tribes. We all know how the British government passed that infamous act of the Criminal Tribes Act in 1871, by which they actually branded a number of Dalit and tribal communities as criminal tribes because they protested against the occupation of forests. So what happened that after independence in 1952, this infamous act was repealed, and they were denotified. Unfortunately, even after denotification, these tribes still experience severe humiliation in the public sphere. In fact, if we talk about the status of the denotified and nomadic tribes, we can find, or we can say, that they are the Dalits amongst the Dalits in the Indian subcontinent. In all the denotified and nomadic tribes' autobiographies, in fact, these autobiographies are written in Marathi. Unfortunately, they can't write in their mother tongue like Bhatu or Sasi. They cannot use their mother tongue because that is not accepted in the public sphere. So they write in Marathi, and those Marathi translations, Marathi writings are translated into English. So if we read some of these autobiographies in English translation of the Indian Dalit writers, we find how the poor women and weak children are the easiest prey of the predatory patriarchal gaze, both inside the untouchable fold and outside. That is also interesting because these women and children are the victims of the male members, the powerful male members of their own society, of their own clan, of their own community. In this context, I would like to quote an observation by Dr. Pashupati Prasad Mahato, who belongs to the Kudmi caste, which is now clamoring for the ST status. Kudmis were earlier claiming themselves as Kshatriyas, and they were not included in the ST fold, but now they actually trace their lineage back to the Harappa civilization, Indus Valley civilization. And so this Pashupati Prasad Mahato, he observes, and this is quite apt in this connection, the consequences of dispossession lead them to extreme poverty, exploitation, oppression, and dehumanization, culminating into cultural silence that debilitates and destroys not only personality, but also cultural excellence and creative genius of the ethnic groups. And in this connection, I would like to refer to two important terms introduced and popularized by G.N. Devi. One is cultural amnesia, where the Dalit and tribal communities are made to forget about their own glorious past. And another thing is cultural aphasia, in which their tongues are cut off. Simply, they cannot represent their own cultural identity, their own cultural legacy. And I refer to three of the major autobiographies here by the denotified and nomadic tribes, the Dalits of the Dalits. One is Kol Tia Che Por. Okay, it's translated into English, it's available. In fact, there is an anthology of tribal literature, Painted Words, an anthology of tribal literature, edited by G.N. Devi, in which you can find extracts of these translated autobiographies. And they have also been published. Kol Tia Che Por by Kishore Shantabai Kale. Another one is Uchalya by Lakshman Rao Gaikwad, who has also received Sahitya Academy Award, Lakshman Rao Gaikwad. Another one is Upara by Lakshman Mane. No, Upara also means the outsider. Okay, Uchalya also means the outsider. Okay, so the main idea is that of being social outsiders and therefore more exposed to the discourse of humiliation. And in fact, if we refer to Dr. Ambedkar, we also find how in the introduction to a recent anthology of Dalit literature, The Exercise of Freedom, an introduction to Dalit writing, edited by K. Satyanarayan and Suzy Tharu, we have found that they have stressed on the humiliating experience of the non-representation of the Dalit leaders in the mainstream political sphere during the freedom struggle. How even Dr. Ambedkar had been kept out of many crucial decision-making meetings. In his autobiographical life story, Waiting for a Visa, I hope many of you have read that, Waiting for a Visa. We included an excerpt of that autobiography in our anthology, Listen to the Flames, Writings on Dalit Literature, published by Oxford University Press in 2016. Okay, in his autobiographical life story, Waiting for a Visa, any sensitive reader will be shocked to discover the nature and extent of his experiences with untouchability. It is important due to the authenticity of his expression of humiliation. As a union minister of law, he had to visit a riot-infected village. When he got down from the train and he was about to drive on a rickshaw, there were no rickshaw pullers available outside the station. Why? Because they had got to know that an untouchable member of Mahar community is going to visit that village. So they were upper caste people. They were not willing to ferry even the union law minister from the railway station to the village. Okay, so one of Ambedkar's followers had to carry him. Okay, and he was a novice. What happened? There was an accident at a turn in which Dr. Ambedkar received serious injuries. But that was the nature and extent of untouchability, practiced in India and recorded in his autobiography. These are the two books I have mentioned, The Exercise of Freedom, which contains many important short stories, poems, excerpts from autobiographies, and excerpts from novels, by Indian Dalit writers from different provinces. And the other one is the autobiography of Dr. Ambedkar, Waiting for a Visa. Now, if we look at the context of humiliation, we find that according to Gopal Guru, because I'll be referring to his book, Humiliation, Claim and Context, the practice of humiliation is closely connected with the rise of modern self. And I quote, "The emergence of the modern self with an intellectual capacity to control, combined with the confidence to conquer vast areas of knowledge, can also produce a tendency to despise those who lack the same capacity for knowledge," unquote. In Dalit autobiographies of other Indian states, this Savarna pride in the so-called superior scriptural knowledge has often given rise to immeasurable hatred for the marginalized Dalit population who have been kept out of the domain of institutionalized knowledge as part of a grand design of exclusion practiced over many centuries. In fact, if we read the autobiographies in the South Indian states, we find how this conflict between knowledge and non-knowledge has aggravated the practice of humiliation in the public sphere. I have mentioned this book, Humiliation, Claims and Context, and this is a major theoretical intervention into the discourse of humiliation as practiced in the Indian subcontinent. Now, humiliation in Dalit autobiographies too, is a rich repository of the genuine expressions of pain affected by humiliation. Okay, if you read Sharan Kumar Limbale's autobiography, Akarmashi, which means the outsider, okay, at one point of time, when the boy narrator is driven out of a public feast and beaten up severely because he had attended the feast uninvited out of a sense of great hunger, okay, he describes himself, his state of humiliation, as I stood there like an unwashed plate. Okay, that was the expression. So the kind of humiliation which was both stinging and stinking in the psyche of the boy narrator, because most of these Dalit autobiographies are seen through the eyes of a boy narrator, an adolescent boy narrator. Okay, because how does he look at the entire trope of humiliation which operates in the society, and how does it affect him? How does it affect his family? How does it affect his community? So Dalit writers used this form of literature as an active tool in expressing their real life experiences of anger and humiliation. We can mention Daya Power's Baluta. It's a very strong autobiographical text, Baluta. Lakshman Mane's Upara, I have already mentioned. And Urmila Power's The Weave of My Life, a Dalit woman's memoir in this context. Okay, and Urmila Power's text is even more interesting because this is written from the perspective of a Dalit woman, okay, who is victimized by the upper caste society and who is also victimized by the male members of her own community. So there is always, a victimization in terms of caste, also in terms of class, and also in terms of gender. And that gender experience also, operates both externally and internally. In fact, humiliation in Akarmashi, I have actually quoted an excerpt from that autobiography because Limbale was the first major Dalit author in the Indian context. Okay, Limbale writes here, I quote, "Whenever an animal in the village died, the villagers grew annoyed. They considered the Maharwada responsible for it. They tied us to a pole and beat us like animals. They accused us of having poisoned the animal. Our women and children cried and shrieked. All the men in the Maharwada were badly beaten. The village ostracized the Maharwada for a few days. Dalit women were badly insulted. Some farmers even harassed them sexually, pulled them into the crop and raped them. Such humiliation was agonizing." So this is what we find in Akarmashi. And there is another very interesting anecdote in this connection, how the representation of humiliation can create a huge rupture in the familial bond. In fact, I had an opportunity to interact with Limbale for a number of times. Okay, at one point of time, he said that after I published Akarmashi, what happened that I was disowned by my own family members. My mother and my sister were angry with me because I had actually depicted the truth in my autobiography. And that created a kind of public shame, which created a great difficulty for my mother and sister. And there was such a situation that Limbale was unable to revisit his village for 1 year. Okay, such was a huge repercussion of that representation. Similar thing happened with Om Prakash Valmiki, okay, when he was about to write, okay, his own autobiography, Jutan. Jutan, which means in English, the leftover. Okay, in Jutan, okay, Valmiki said that he was working as a cheap labor in a factory. The upper caste, co-workers, when they came to know that Valmiki was planning to write his autobiography, threatened him with dire consequences. Okay, they actually threatened him to beat up and insult him publicly if anything negative is written in that autobiography. So there was also that fear, the fear of being humiliated as a reward for self-representation. Okay, so such was the situation. I have referred to that text, The Outcast, translated from Marathi by Santosh Bhumkar. Okay, and it's really good to know that Oxford University Press came up in a big way in publishing the autobiographies of the Dalit writers, and that actually created a greater cultural visibility of these Dalit autobiographies in the global context. In fact, I again quote another excerpt from Jutan by Om Prakash Valmiki. He is from the Hindi heartland. He was actually from Uttar Pradesh. They did not call us by our names. Look at the extent of humiliation. If a person were older, then he would be called We Chude. If the person were younger or of the same age, then Abe Chude was used. Untouchability was so rampant that while it was considered all right to touch dogs and cats or cows and buffaloes, if one, a higher caste person, happened to touch a chuda, one got contaminated or polluted. The chudas were not seen as human. They were simply things for use. Their utility lasted until the work was done. Use them and then throw them away. That was the attitude towards the untouchables, ex-untouchables. So Jutan, this is also a very famous autobiography, An Untouchable's Life, translated from Hindi into English by Arun Prabha Mukherjee. Okay. And that is also a major text of Dalit literature. In fact, humiliation is there also in Marathi Dalit poetry. We know that the Dalit Panthers movement began in Maharashtra, and we also know that Maharashtra is the hotbed of the rise of Dalit movement. In fact, there are numerous Dalit poems written in Marathi and later translated into English by many people. In fact, a major anthology was published by Mulkraj Anand and Eleanor Zeliot, an anthology of Dalit literature. So in Marathi Dalit poetry, this process of contempt or repugnance for people devoid of the capacity to earn knowledge is quite noticeable. In fact, I have quoted one poem by Namdev Dhasal, a leading Dalit poet, Marathi Dalit poet. Their eternal pity, no taller than a pimp on Falkland Road, no pavilion put up in the sky for us. Lords of wealth, they are locking up light in those vaults of theirs. In this life, carried by a whore, not even the sidewalks are ours. Made so beggarly, it is nausea to be human. Cannot feel our gut, even with shriveled dust. Each new just day supports them as if bright. Not a sigh slips through the fingers of day's plant as we are cut down. So this is a very memorable expression. We find also expression of humiliation in Telugu Dalit poetry. In fact, there is a very famous Telugu Dalit woman poet, Chalapalli Swarupa Rani. And she wrote a brilliant poem entitled Water. In fact, I would like to read a few lines from that poem. The water knows everything. It knows the difference of race between the Samaria woman and Jesus the Jew. It also knows the subcaste difference between leather and spool. It knows the agony of the Panchama, that is the Dalits, who, not having the right to draw a pot of water, waits all day near the well with his empty pot until a Shudra arrives. Because a Dalit is not even a Shudra. A Dalit is Ati Shudra. It knows the humiliation of the Vada girl when he, who poured the water from a distance, falls all over and touches her. It knows the righteous rage of Karamchedu Subharthama, who opposed the Kamma landlords with her water pot when they asked her not to pollute the pond water. In fact, Subharthama, who was an old Dalit woman, his raising of her water pot, it was actually in self-defense to ward off the knife that was thrown at her, was taken as an offense and was the ostensible reason for the Kamma upper caste landlords going on a rampage, killing over a dozen Dalits in Karamchedu in 1985. It was merely the right to draw water from the pond. This is a Chalapalli Swaruparani. Yes, now I come back to the question of Bengal, and that interview with Manoranjan Bapari. Shipra Mukherjee asks this question. It has often been said that caste oppression is absent in Bengal. How would you react to this statement? Manoranjan Bapari says, when compared to many of the other states of India, I would agree that the harshness of caste discrimination seen in other states is far less in Bengal. There have been the Sufi and the Baul movements which have weakened the caste system here, while many among the lower oppressed castes have converted to Islam. It is because of this history that the Communist Party could convince the Dalits of Bengal that the real divide was that of class, not caste. This is the observation of Manoranjan Bapari. And he continues there, if you ask me, that is the divide, I believe is still the strongest. The real divide is between the Bhadraloks and the Chotoloks, which is why the few Dalits who manage to make money and get rich drift away from us poor Dalits. The idea of being declassed. They may still appear to be part of the struggle, but their priorities are different from ours. So how does he speak about the graded inequality which exists even amongst the Dalits of Bengal? This is Manoranjan Bapari in that Jaipur Literature Festival, because he is the most visible face of Dalit writers from Bengal. There was also a YouTube interview of Manoranjan Bapari with Nasiruddin Shah. I hope some of you have seen it. And it's very relevant, how Bapari says all these things quite candidly in that interview. And I would now like to refer to some statistics, some reports. Actually a little bit old, the Hindu report on 2nd October 2020. That is statistics offered by National Crime Records Bureau. It shows that 84% of the entire caste atrocities took place particularly in the 9 states of India: Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, Bihar, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Kerala, and Odisha. And the numbers are also given here, where we find that the number of crime, particularly caste-based atrocities, is not that much in Bengal. It is only 119 compared to Uttar Pradesh, 11,829. So that is also a marker if we look at the statistics. And the reduced caste atrocities in Bengal, it is ubiquitous that there are certain reasons which worked on to reduce the caste atrocities in Bengal, even after 7 decades of our independence. As a result, the intensity of Dalit movement has got a less visibility in Bengal in comparison with Maharashtra and the northern and southern regions of India. In fact, I'm referring to an article published in early 2012, where an intellectual from Bengal writes an article published in Indian literature, published by Sahitya Academy. The title of this article was interesting. Is there any Dalit literature in Bengal? Okay, that was the title of the article. Okay, and so it shows, how there was a perception that Dalit movement has not produced considerable amount of Dalit literature in Bengal. What was the major reason? The major reason was the lack of translation of Bengali Dalit writings into English and Hindi and other major Indian languages. The process, which actually began from late 2012 with the publication of Survival and Other Stories. Okay, so that was the first major narrative which actually busted this myth that is there any Dalit literature in Bengal. So I shall try to investigate some of the factors now. Number one, I would like to refer to the impact of Buddhism in Bengal. Okay, Buddhism exercised its prodigious impact in Bengal from 8th to the 10th century, particularly, and these are palpable in the Buddhist hymns and songs. From the inscriptions of Lakshman Sen and Haripal Dev, we get to know that even during the 12th century, Buddhism continued to work out its stimulus among the common folks of Bengal. If we look at the transcript of the Bodhicharya avatar, it also sanctions the presence of Buddhism in the 15th century. These are the primary explanations of the lower intensity of caste-related oppression in Bengal. Even in the idylls like Chondi Mongol and Dharma Mongol, which are very popular oral epics, later written down, which were transcribed during the medieval times, we do not find any caste-related tortures or exploitations. In fact, I have given the cover pages of Chondi Mongol by Kavi Konkon Mukundaram and also Dharma Mongol by Manikram Ganguly. So if you can go through it, I'm not aware of any available English translation of Chondi Mongol and Dharma Mongol, although there had been translation of Manusha Mongol, I know that, but one can find it there. Another thing was the impact of Sena dynasty on the caste politics of Bengal. In fact, it was during the regime of Sen dynasty that Brahmins established themselves as a stronger and superior force, perhaps for the first time under the patronage of Ballal Sen, who was chiefly responsible for the initiation of the caste system in Bengal and the consequent caste-based oppression and humiliation. In fact, this claim is clearly discerned in the manuscripts like the Brahmana Sarvaswa we find during the Sen period, which was written by Halayud. In Halayud, we find the predominance of the Brahmins. And there was Guna Vishnu, who also narrated the contemporary scenario in his Chandogya Mantra Bhashya, which was where he mentioned that people like Jimut Bahan and the Bhatta Bhabadev advocated the Brahmin superiority and helped immensely in launching the caste-based hierarchy. It happened during the Sena dynasty. But there was also the impact of Sufism and the Bhakti movement with regard to the caste dynamics in Bengal. The situation changed. And the lower caste people got a kind of relief from this caste-based discrimination when Ikhtiaruddin Muhammad bin Bakhtiar Khilji of the Delhi Sultanate conquered most parts of Bengal, defeating the Sena king Lakshmana Sen in 1203-1204 and founded Islamic regime in Bengal. In fact, during this period, the lower caste people of Bengal, who were oppressed by the Brahminical rule, were attracted to Sufism, and a large number of lower caste people embraced Islam to get over this caste-based abuse. The Bhakti movement was also responsible for this lesser impact of caste-based oppression, led by Sri Chaitanya Dev. Okay, it was a phenomenon in the history of Bengal which helped to decrease the caste oppression in Bengal. However, one interesting fact is that the fourfold caste system, okay, that comprised the Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras, as cited in Manusmriti, did not exist in Bengal during that period. It was always twofold. Brahmins were the ruling side, and they used to treat the rest as socially inferiors and abused them with cruelty. We also find that this lessening of the caste-based humiliation was largely due to the domination of Vaishnavism in Bengal, which is still very strong, not only in Bengal, but also in Odisha and Jharkhand, especially in the eastern India. Vaishnavism, with its idea of equality and fraternity, appeared as a savior to the socially marginalized lower caste people who started converting themselves to Islam to get rid of oppression and exploitation. Being freed from any kind of orthodoxy, this idea of equality and fraternity of Vaishnavism attracted the oppressed people and prevented them from embracing Islam. This movement was led by Sri Chaitanya, and it resulted in removing the concept of discrimination based on caste to a large extent. In fact, we find reference to this in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, how there was the message of equality and fraternity. And there was also the impact of folk traditions. Bengal has always been rich in folk traditions. And folk traditions played a significant role in diminishing the humiliation of lower caste people by inspiring them to protest against the caste system through different oral modes of narratives and performances. Followers of Sahajiya, Aul, and Baul traditions showed their disgust for the caste discrimination and Brahmin dominance. And there were great people, leaders like Siraj Sai, Lalan Fakir, and Pagla Kanai, who had significant influences upon the folk people. Enhancing the idea of humanistic religion, the Sahajiyas, Auls, and Bauls tried to unify society without any discrimination, which attracted Rabindranath even to so deeply that he had great respect for these folk traditions. If we read his essay, Religion of Man, we find how Rabindranath was profoundly inspired by the tradition of the Bauls. And he also had some interactions with Lalan Fakir. It is in record when he visited his zamindari there in East Bengal then. So there was close connection, and it is often said that many of Tagore's songs of that period are inspired by Lalan Fakir. The Religion of Man I have mentioned here, where he has spoken of the Baul tradition. Now also let us look at the political scenario of Bengal. I have already mentioned the defeat of Lakshman Sen by Ikhtiaruddin Muhammad bin Bakhtiyar Khilji, whereby the Islamic tradition was established, the rule was established, and there were many conversions to Islam. There was also the rule of the tribal and Dalit kings in different parts of Bengal. That was also a major factor. For example, the Koch kings. Koch actually comes from Kocha crowd. Kochs were the ancient tribal population who were in the northern part of Bengal and also in Assam. And they actually created the concept of Kamtapur, which was a religious dynasty. They were followers of Shaivism. And the Kocha king ruled over northern part of Bengal for a long period of time. In fact, the Rajbongshis are the descendants of the Kochs. And then there were also the Malla king in Bishnupur, who also belonged to the Dalit caste, the lower caste, and the Manikya dynasty in Tripura. They also belonged to the lower caste. In fact, there were lower caste kings of Bengal. So from a closer scrutiny of this political history of Bengal, it is quite obvious that throughout the Middle Ages of Bengal, it was ruled by the Muslims, and the territorial kings who had lower caste background Since the kings themselves were from the lower caste origins, there was no trace of caste discrimination that didn't allow the caste violence to take place to a large extent. In fact, I would also like to name one very important king, generally very less discussed in history, Ramchandra Khan Laskar. He was from the Pondra community. Pondra is regarded as a very untouchable community in Bengal. Pondra community ruled the southern region of the entire south and north 24 Parganas, including the Sundarbans of both India and Bangladesh. That was undivided then. And his name is found in Vrindavan Das's text, Chaitanya Bhagavat. These issues are evident in other contemporary writing. For example, Hitesh Ranjan Sannal wrote an essay entitled Mallabhum in the volume on tribal polities and state systems in pre-colonial Eastern and Northeastern India, okay, edited by Surajit Sinha. This is a significant publication highlighting the nature of the lower caste kings of the then period and how it impacted the folk belief system to a large extent. And Vishnupada Das's work on some aspects of socio-economic changes in southwestern frontier Bengal since the introduction of Neo-Vaishnavism. I have referred to Sri Chaitanya Bhagavata and also this book, Tribal Polities and State Systems in Pre-Colonial Eastern and Northeastern India. And there was also another important demographic factor, which also helped in lessening the kind of atrocities which we find in some other states, was also the rising number of Dalit population in Bengal. Okay, if we look at the census of 2011, we find that the scheduled castes constitute 23% of the total population, whereas the scheduled tribes 6% and the Muslims occupy 27%. And you should also find here that amongst the Muslims, there are also OBCAs, okay, the other backward classes. So apart from them, a large number of other backward class people who were also OBCBs, non-Muslims, okay, they constitute a large number of Bengal's population. So the Brahmins are comparatively sparse in number. Okay. And people of Rajbangshi community, if we look at the demographic representation, 18.4% of the SC population in West Bengal, they stay in North Bengal and they are a major presence there. And people from Bagdi community, that is a very untouchable community, 14.9% of the SC population in West Bengal, they rule in the southern part of Bengal. And Pondra, I have just mentioned, 12% of the SC population in West Bengal, they stay in South Bengal. And another important community is the Namashudra. They are really the vote bank for all the political parties of Bengal. Not even Bengal, but also in Bangladesh. Because Namashudras, who are also followers of the Matua religion, okay, are quite large in number. They occupy 17.4% of the SC population in West Bengal. They also occupy nearly 20% of the SC population in Bangladesh. And these Namashudras are always considered as vote banks, though they were the inhabitants of East Bengal. After the partition, most of them migrated to West Bengal and lived in a particular region that is North and South 24 Parganas. So this unity of Dalits, because they have created Matua Maha Sangh, and they are a very powerful united presence in Bengal, along with a huge number of their population and a dwindling number of Brahmin population, help to keep the caste-based discrimination and humiliation in control in Bengal. And of course, another major factor is the leftist movement. I have already referred to that in the interview of Monoranjan Bapari. That is accountable for the comparatively decent condition of Dalits in Bengal is the current of leftist movement in the state that flourished after the independence. So Dalit movement and leftist movement share some traits in common. And if you read that book by Sharan Kumar Limbale, Towards an Aesthetic of Dalit Literature, you will find there is a chapter devoted to a comparative study of Ambedkar and Karl Marx. And there is actually a debate between the importance of caste and class in the context of India. So what happened that the leftist movement did not allow the fundamentalists to continue their practice of caste-based discrimination. The influence of leftist intellectuals upon the Dalit intellectuals of Bengal has already been corroborated in the interview of Manoranjan Bapari. He has analyzed the very subtle workings of the caste-based discriminations during the communist regime in Bengal. In fact, the history of Dalit literature also goes back to the time of the Charyapada, which was composed in the 10th century. We find how the Charyapada were Buddhists, the poets were Buddhists, like Luipad, Bhusukupad, Kanhapad, and many others. They were Buddhists, but originally they were Dalits, were converted to Buddhism. And they were like Domes and Kapalis and others. In their writings, we find the element of Dalitism. And we find however, there is a strong intellectual current that could be felt in their creative output. We find it in the Charyapada and also in the later writings by the Dalit authors. I have given one translation of Charyapada by Tanveer Ratul. So in Bengal, the cravings for self-uplift among the lower castes began in the 19th century. If we want to term it as a caste renaissance. When communities like Namashudra, Poundra, and Hardy initiated a social movement to upgrade themselves in the political and cultural spheres. In fact, the quantum of literary studies they produced was imbued with their caste consciousness and an authentic cerebral culture, which put up a natural resistance against the ferocity of caste oppression in Bengal. There was that self-respect movement. I have given some texts here in defense of my argument. Yes, I know that. I have to finish it. Like I just give it for your record. Jati Chandrika, Jati Vivek, Diner Atma Kahini, a short history of the ethnology of the cultivating poets, Banglar Jati Samosya. These are very old writings in the 19th century and also in the 20th century. And the earliest remarkable Dalit magazines was Namashudra Shurit, first published in 1912, Pataka in 1914. And the first major Dalit epic was Jatiya Jagaran. Jatiya doesn't mean nationalist, it means caste. The uprising of the Namashudra caste. That was the first Dalit epic. And then there were other confederation of Dalit writers as well. In 1987, the first one was Bongio Lekhak Porishad, then Bangla Dalit Sahitya Sangstha, and the publication of its journal Chothurto Duniya. In the first published anthology, translated anthology of Dalit writings, Survival and Other Stories, we actually translated the stories which were published in Chothurto Duniya. So there were many journals like Dalit Kantho, Odol Bodol, Ajker Ekolobbo, Neel Akash, many texts are there. So writing was seen as an antidote to humiliation. And there were major writers like Kopil Krishna Thakur, Jatin Bala, Gautam Haldar, Bimolendu Haldar. Many were there who were writing autobiographies, narratives, and also poetry and critical essays. In fact, we are very happy that even Routledge UK has come up with a series of the Dalit writers or Dalit writings. The first one was published in 2023, Selected Writings of Anil Ghodai, Dalit Literature from Bangla. And there was also other writings where there is depiction of lesser humiliation in Bengali Dalit narratives. There was another, the second one published in this series by Routledge UK, Selected Writings of Shamol Kumar Pramanik, Dalit Literature from Bangla. So Dalit protest literature is a clarion call to the Dalit to unite themselves, to consolidate. Okay, and I have referred to a poem by Pashupati Prasad Mahato, A Lorai Shuru Hoyeche. This combat has just begun. Okay, and how they respond to the derisive attitude of the so-called upper caste people, and how they have consolidated into a major force. But there is one glorious exception. With this, I would conclude my presentation. That is of Chuni Kotal, the only voice of intense humiliation. Okay, a member of the Lodha Sabar community. Okay, a member of the denotified and nomadic tribe. There are two DNT communities in Bengal. One of them, Chuni Kotal, graduated from a college in anthropology, and he was studying master's degree in anthropology in a university. And she was the victim of this caste-based humiliation and insult to such an extent that she had to commit suicide. Okay. So Chuni Kotal is the sole exception, because in Chuni Kotal we find that voice of intense humiliation. And this is quite unlike the other Dalit writings visible in Bengal. So unfortunately, there was no follow-up of this DNT writings on humiliation in Bengal after Chuni Kotal's suicide. We haven't found any major voice. This is the photograph of Chuni Kotal, member of the denotified and nomadic tribes. Okay, I just read a few lines and conclude. A translation from Chuni Kotal's poem Pratibad, Protest. All men and women of the branded Lodha Pada flee their village in awe and terror. All rush to the nearby forest, chased by the armed goons of the ruler. The barren land witnesses a bloodbath. Lodhas are butchered like sacrificial lambs. Older people die in the frantic jostle. The genocide happened, the mindless tussle. Nobody did protest. Many days elapsed. Nobody was charged with the attack. On 4th July, the media report, police had recovered 6 dead dacoits. Look at the term dacoits. Lodhas are dacoits. They can never be citizens. Isn't there any court of justice in this country? Don't they deserve justice in their own land? That was a translation of Chuni Kotal's poem. So in Bengal, there had been orchestrated political moves to exclude caste as a significant parameter of social reality and replace it with the Marxian notion of class, borrowed from the Western discourse of social engineering. In the pan-Indian context, the caste system is a constructed curse on society, and its assumption as real is merely a disguise for its structural imposition. In Bengal, the systematic plantation of a Savarna ideology meets with a spirited counter-ideological drive by the Dalit authors in the colonial and post-colonial eras. So it lessened the venom of caste-based repugnance to a large extent. That is the main tone of my presentation. That is the way I have attempted to show the way Dalit literature has developed in Bengal. Thank you.
Thank you very much.